September 15, 1944. The dust rose in thick clouds as the military transport truck rumbled down the unpaved road toward the Henderson Ranch in West Texas. Inside the covered bed, 17 Japanese women sat in silence, their hands folded in their laps, their faces carefully composed masks of dignity, despite the fear that churned beneath their calm exteriors. They had been captured 3 months earlier in the Aleutian Islands, serving as civilian administrators and nurses for Japanese military operations. Now they were being transported to what American officials described as a temporary detention facility, but what the women understood to be a prison camp in enemy territory. Lieutenant James Crawford stood beside the ranch's main gate, watching the approaching vehicle with a mixture of curiosity and profound discomfort. The 32-year-old officer had been reassigned from active duty after taking shrapnel in his leg during the Italian campaign. He had expected to spend his recovery period overseeing male prisoners, not women. The very idea violated something fundamental in his Texas upbringing. His grandmother had raised him with one unbreakable rule: you protected women, you didn't guard them behind barbed wire. The truck came to a halt, and the tailgate dropped with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty prairie. Lieutenant Crawford's first glimpse of the prisoners caught him off guard. These were not the fanatical warriors that propaganda posters depicted. They were young women, most appearing to be in their early 20s, dressed in simple civilian clothes that had seen better days. Their dark hair was pulled back in neat styles despite months of displacement, and they moved with a precise grace that spoke of careful upbringing and rigid self-control. 24-year-old Keiko Tanaka was the first to step down from the truck. She had been a schoolteacher in Hokkaido before being recruited to serve as a translator for military administrative offices in the Aleutians. Now she stood on foreign soil, surrounded by men whose language she barely understood and whose physical presence was unlike anything she had experienced in Japan. The American guards towered over her, their broad shoulders and sturdy frames making her feel smaller than her 5 feet of height already did. She clutched a small cloth bundle containing her only possessions: a photograph of her parents, a worn English dictionary, and a jade pendant her grandmother had given her for protection. The ranch stretched out before them, a sprawling collection of wooden buildings surrounded by endless horizon. Barbed wire fencing had been hastily erected to create a compound, but unlike the forbidding prison camps the women had imagined, this place still bore the character of a working ranch. Horses grazed in distant pastures, and the smell of hay and cattle drifted on the warm September breeze. It was beautiful in a stark, open way that felt both liberating and terrifying to women, accustomed to Japan's dense cities and careful gardens. Lieutenant Crawford cleared his throat and began to speak, his words translated haltingly by a Japanese-American soldier who looked almost as uncomfortable as the prisoners felt. The ranch hands had gathered near the bunkhouse, watching the arrival, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. These men had not enlisted for military service due to age, injury, or the critical nature of their work supplying beef to the war effort. But they all had brothers, sons, or nephews fighting in the Pacific, and the sight of Japanese prisoners on their land stirred complicated emotions they were not accustomed to examining. Tom Sullivan, the ranch foreman, was a weathered man of 53 whose son Michael was serving with the Marines somewhere in the Solomon Islands. He had volunteered to help oversee the prisoner facility, partly from patriotic duty and partly because the military compensation helped support his daughter-in-law and 2 grandchildren. Now, watching these small women file into the compound, he felt a knot of confusion in his chest. He had prepared himself to guard dangerous enemies. These looked like somebody's daughters. The women were led to a converted barn that had been divided into sleeping quarters. The space was clean but sparse, with rows of cots covered in military-issue blankets. Small windows near the ceiling allowed light and air but prevented any view of the surrounding landscape. Keiko chose a cot near the back wall, seeking the illusion of privacy in the communal space. Around her, the other women began to settle in with quiet efficiency, unpacking their meager belongings and speaking in whispers that barely disturbed the heavy silence. Outside, ranch hand Billy Martinez leaned against the fence, absently rolling a cigarette. The 28-year-old had grown up on the ranch, his Mexican-American family having worked this land for 3 generations. He understood what it meant to be seen as different, to be judged by appearance rather than character. But these were Japanese, the enemy who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who were fighting his cousins in the Pacific. How was he supposed to reconcile his natural inclination toward fairness with his duty to his country and his family? Lieutenant Crawford observed the interaction between his makeshift staff and the prisoners with growing concern. He had been given minimal guidance from his superiors, beyond basic security protocols and Geneva Convention requirements. The War Department had apparently not anticipated capturing Japanese women in significant numbers, and the usual procedures felt inadequate for this unprecedented situation. He had commanded men in combat, had made life and death decisions under fire, but somehow this assignment felt more complicated than anything he had faced on the battlefield. As evening fell across the Texas prairie, Keiko sat on her cot and opened her English dictionary. She had studied the language in school, but her practical knowledge was limited. If she was going to survive this imprisonment, she needed to understand her captors. Through the small window above her head, she could see the first stars appearing in the vast American sky. They were the same stars that shone over Japan, over her parents' home, over the life that now seemed impossibly distant and perhaps forever lost. The first week passed in tense routine. The women rose at dawn, attended roll call, performed assigned cleaning duties, and received 3 meals delivered by guards who spoke as little as possible. The Americans maintained professional distance, their interactions limited to necessary instructions and head counts. But silence did not mean blindness, and both sides observed each other with careful attention to details that revealed more than words could convey. In the evenings, after the guards had completed their final rounds, the Japanese women gathered in small groups to share whispered conversations. Keiko found herself drawn to these discussions, particularly with Yuki Nakamura, a 26-year-old nurse who had tended wounded soldiers in field hospitals before her capture. Yuki possessed a practical, observant nature that helped her adapt to their new circumstances with remarkable composure. It was during one of these evening gatherings that the comparisons began. Fumiko Sato, a 19-year-old who had served as a clerk, spoke first in hushed Japanese. "Have you noticed how large they are? The American men? Not just tall, but their shoulders, their hands. Everything about them is so much bigger than our soldiers back home." The observation opened a floodgate of similar remarks. The women had all noticed, but had been uncertain whether it was appropriate to discuss. Now, with the words spoken aloud, they shared their astonishment at the physical differences between the American ranch workers and the Japanese men they had known. Keiko estimated that the average guard stood at least 6 feet tall, with frames that suggested strength built through years of physical labor rather than military training. But it was not just size that struck them. There was something unexpected in how these large men moved and spoke. Despite their imposing physical presence, many displayed a careful gentleness in their actions. Tom Sullivan, the foreman who looked fierce with his sun-weathered face and permanent squint, had been observed helping an injured bird back into its nest. Billy Martinez, whose broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of hard labor, hummed softly while performing his duties, his voice carrying melodies that sounded almost sad. These observations confused the women's understanding of their captors. They had been taught that American soldiers were brutal and merciless, that capture meant certain torture or death. Yet these men seemed uncomfortable with their role as jailers. They delivered meals with downcast eyes, as if embarrassed by the women's circumstances. They maintained the required distance, but without the cruelty or contempt the prisoners had been conditioned to expect. Yuki articulated what others were thinking, but hesitated to say aloud. "They treat us like we might break. Like we are fragile things they are afraid to damage. It is strange to be feared and protected at the same time, by the same people." Keiko nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the worn cover of her English dictionary. She was beginning to suspect that understanding these Americans would require more than learning their language. It would require unlearning everything she thought she knew about enemies. The October morning arrived cold and unexpected, the temperature dropping 30 degrees overnight in the unpredictable way of Texas weather. The converted barn had been adequate for September's warmth, but the thin walls offered little protection against the sudden cold front. By mid-morning, several of the women were visibly shivering despite layering their limited clothing. Keiko noticed that Michiko Yamamoto, a frail 20-year-old who had been sick during their transport, was shaking violently, her lips turning a worrying shade of blue. Yuki immediately recognized the signs of hypothermia. She called out in English, her accent thick, but her alarm clear. "Help! She is very cold, very sick. Need help now." The urgency in her voice carried across the compound to where Billy Martinez was repairing a section of fence. He dropped his tools and ran toward the barn, his cowboy boots kicking up dust as he moved with surprising speed for his size. Lieutenant Crawford arrived moments later, summoned by Billy's shouts. The scene inside the barn shocked him. Michiko lay on her cot, barely conscious, while Yuki tried to warm her with their combined blankets. The other women hovered nearby, their faces etched with worry and helplessness. Crawford's military training kicked in immediately. He barked orders to Billy to fetch Dr. Reynolds from town and to bring every available blanket from the ranch house. But it was Tom Sullivan who made the decision that would change everything. The gruff foreman, who had maintained the strictest emotional distance from the prisoners, took one look at the shivering girl and made a choice that violated protocol. He scooped Michiko into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her toward the ranch house. "We are not letting anyone freeze to death on my watch. Regulations be damned," he growled at Crawford's startled expression. Within minutes, Michiko was wrapped in quilts near the ranch house fireplace, hot tea being pressed to her lips by Tom's wife Margaret, who had appeared from the kitchen with the take-charge manner of a woman accustomed to managing crises. Yuki knelt beside her patient, monitoring her pulse and breathing, while Margaret brought heated stones wrapped in cloth to place around Michiko's body. The two women worked together without sharing a common language, their shared purpose transcending the need for words. Keiko stood in the doorway, uncertain whether she was allowed inside but unwilling to leave Michiko's side. Margaret caught her eye and gestured firmly. "Come in, child." No sense standing out there freezing too. The kindness in her weathered face was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Keiko had been taught to expect, that she felt tears spring to her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, maintaining the composure her culture demanded, but something inside her chest cracked open just slightly. Dr. Reynolds arrived an hour later and confirmed that Michiko would recover, thanks to the quick action of everyone involved. As he prepared to leave, he looked at Lieutenant Crawford with a meaningful expression. These women need better shelter before winter truly arrives. That evening, after Michiko had been returned to the barn with extra blankets and a promise that heating stoves would be installed by week's end, the women gathered in their usual circle. But the atmosphere had shifted. The crisis had cracked the wall of silence that had separated captors and captives, and in that crack, new observations began to emerge. Fumiko spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see how easily Mr. Sullivan carried Michiko? Like she was a child, not a grown woman. His hands were so large they could wrap completely around her waist." The other women nodded, having witnessed the same astonishing display of strength delivered with unexpected gentleness. But it was not just physical size that occupied their whispered conversations. Yuki, who had worked alongside Margaret Sullivan, shared her observations with careful precision. "The foreman's wife, she is tall for a woman, nearly as tall as our men back home, and yet her husband makes her look small when he stands beside her. I have never seen such differences between men and women in stature." Keiko had been studying her English dictionary by candlelight, but she set it aside to join the discussion. "In Japan, our soldiers were strong, but lean, built for endurance and discipline. These Americans, they are built differently, like they were made for a bigger landscape, for bigger work." She struggled to articulate what she was observing. Everything here is larger. The land, the sky, the cattle, the men. Perhaps people grow to match their environment. Haruko Ito, a quiet 30-year-old who rarely spoke, surprised everyone by adding her own observation. "I watched the young one, Martinez. He was stacking hay bales this afternoon. Each bale must weigh as much as Fumiko, yet he lifted them like they were pillows. And when he saw me watching, he looked embarrassed, like his strength was something to be ashamed of rather than proud of. This comment sparked a deeper conversation about the paradox they were witnessing. These men possessed physical power that could easily overwhelm them, yet they wielded that power with restraint. They carried weapons but seemed uncomfortable doing so. They maintained distance, but their eyes reflected concern rather than contempt. The disconnect between what the women had been taught about American brutality and what they were actually experiencing created a cognitive dissonance that kept them awake long into the night. Yuki voiced the question that haunted them all. If we were wrong about this, about their nature, what else might we have been wrong about? The question hung in the cold air of the barn, unanswerable but impossible to ignore. Keiko pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared at the wooden ceiling beams. She thought about the jade pendant around her neck, given to her for protection against enemies. But what if these giants with their careful hands and uncomfortable eyes were not the enemies she had been taught to fear? What if the real enemy had been the lies she had been told about them? The heating stoves arrived 3 days later, delivered by a supply truck from the nearest military depot. But it was the accompanying delivery that surprised everyone. Margaret Sullivan had convinced her husband to supplement the military rations with food from the ranch kitchen. She appeared at the compound gate with a wagon loaded with fresh bread, butter churned that morning, and a large pot of beef stew that filled the autumn air with rich, savory aromas. Lieutenant Crawford initially hesitated, citing regulations about fraternization and proper prisoner rations. But Margaret fixed him with the same stern look she had used to raise 3 sons and manage ranch hands for 30 years. "Young man, I do not care what your regulations say. Nobody eats bland military slop when there is good food available. These girls are half-starved as it is." The lieutenant, despite his rank and authority, found himself retreating in the face of her determination. The women gathered uncertainly as the food was distributed. They had been subsisting on basic military rations, adequate for survival, but bland and unfamiliar to palates accustomed to rice and fish. The stew represented their first taste of true American home cooking, and the experience proved unexpectedly emotional. Keiko took her first careful bite, expecting to dislike the heavy, meat-centered dish. Instead, she found herself savoring flavors that were foreign, yet somehow comforting. The beef was tender, the vegetables soft, the broth rich with herbs she could not identify but which warmed her from the inside out. Around her, the other women were having similar experiences. Even Michiko, still weak from her ordeal, managed to eat a full bowl and ask quietly for more. Margaret watched their reactions with satisfaction, seeing in their faces the universal language of hunger being satisfied by good food made with care. She had been uncertain about having Japanese prisoners on the ranch, her son's letters from the Pacific filling her with complicated feelings about the enemy. But watching these thin young women eat the stew she had made, she saw only someone's daughters far from home. Billy Martinez, who had helped transport the food, found himself lingering near the barn entrance. He watched Keiko attempt to use the American spoon with the same careful precision she applied to everything, her small hands making the utensil look oversized. When she caught him watching, she startled, then surprised both of them by offering a small bow of gratitude. Billy nodded awkwardly in return, touching the brim of his hat in the gesture his mother had taught him for acknowledging ladies. That evening, Tom Sullivan found his wife at their kitchen window, looking toward the compound where candlelight flickered in the barn windows. "You thinking about Michael?" he asked quietly, knowing she worried constantly about their son fighting somewhere in the Pacific. Margaret nodded slowly. "I keep wondering if some Japanese mother is feeding our boy hot stew, hoping someone somewhere is treating her son with kindness." Tom put his weathered hand on her shoulder, having no answer to give but understanding perfectly what she meant. November brought the first letters to reach the compound, carried by military mail services that had finally processed the prisoners' locations and established contact protocols. Lieutenant Crawford distributed them during morning roll call, calling out names in his careful pronunciation of Japanese syllables. Only 5 women received letters that day. 12 others waited with visible hope that dimmed when the distribution ended without their names being called. Keiko was among those who received nothing. She had written to her parents 3 times since her capture, following the approved procedures for prisoner correspondence, but had no way of knowing if her letters had reached Hokkaido or if her parents even knew she was alive. The uncertainty gnawed at her more painfully than hunger or cold ever could. She watched Yuki open her letter with trembling hands, saw the nurse's face crumple as she read, and knew immediately that the news was not good. Later, in the privacy of their evening gathering, Yuki shared what she had learned. Her younger brother had been killed in action in the Philippines 3 months earlier. Her parents' letter was brief, constrained by censorship and grief, but the pain bled through every carefully chosen word. They wrote that they were proud of his sacrifice, that he had died honorably for the emperor. But between those formal phrases, Yuki could read her mother's heartbreak, could sense her father's struggle to maintain the stoic dignity their culture demanded, even as his world collapsed. The news cast a shadow over the entire group. These women had been largely isolated from information about the war's progress, knowing only what their captors chose to share. Now, through Yuki's letter, they were confronted with the continuing cost of the conflict that had brought them to this Texas ranch. Fumiko wept quietly for Yuki's loss, while Haruko sat in stunned silence, thinking of her own 2 brothers serving somewhere in the Pacific. The guards noticed the change in atmosphere. Billy Martinez observed Yuki sitting alone during the evening meal, her food untouched, her eyes distant. He approached Lieutenant Crawford with an unusual request. "Sir, I know it is not standard procedure, but would it be appropriate to offer condolences? Her brother was killed. That is not about politics or war. That is just losing family." Crawford considered the question carefully, aware that any gesture could be seen as fraternization or weakness. Yet he also recognized the humanity in Billy's impulse. Tom Sullivan made the decision for them. He approached Yuki the next morning, hat in hand, his weathered face showing an emotion he rarely displayed. "Miss Nakamura, my wife and I heard about your brother. We are sorry for your loss. A soldier's death is hard on those left behind, no matter which flag he served under." Yuki looked up at this large man who had carried Michiko to safety, who now stood before her, offering sympathy despite their countries being at war. She bowed deeply, tears streaming down her face, and whispered in halting English the only words she could manage. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing him as a person, not just an enemy." The weeks following Yuki's news brought subtle shifts in the compound's daily rhythms. Tom Sullivan began teaching basic ranch skills to the women, initially as a way to give them purposeful work beyond cleaning duties, but gradually evolving into something that resembled genuine instruction. He showed them how to mend fence wire, how to properly stack hay to prevent mold, how to read the weather signs in the endless Texas sky. His teaching style was gruff but patient, correcting mistakes without criticism, demonstrating when words failed to bridge the language gap. Keiko found herself fascinated by the unspoken code that seemed to govern these ranchmen. They spoke little, but their actions revealed a consistent moral framework. A man's word was sacred. Hard work was respected above clever talk. Women, children, and animals were to be protected, not exploited. Those who had less were helped without expectation of recognition or reward. It was a value system both foreign and strangely familiar to her Japanese understanding of honor, yet expressed through completely different cultural behaviors. Billy Martinez embodied these principles in ways that confused and intrigued her. The young ranch hand stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broadened by years of physical labor, his hands calloused and strong. Yet he moved through the world with a gentle awareness that seemed at odds with his powerful build. She watched him one afternoon carefully relocating a snake that had wandered near the barn, speaking softly to the creature as he carried it to safer ground. When he noticed her watching, he explained in simple English that even dangerous things deserved respect and a chance to live their lives without interference. The contrast with Japanese soldiers she had known was stark. Those men had been trained to view strength as dominance, to see gentleness as weakness. They had been taught that showing mercy to enemies was dishonorable, that compassion undermined military discipline. Yet here was Billy Martinez, who could probably break a man in half with his bare hands, treating a poisonous snake with careful consideration for its well-being. Margaret Sullivan noticed Keiko's observations and took it upon herself to explain the cowboy philosophy that shaped these men. "We live in hard country," she told Keiko during one of her food deliveries. "The land does not forgive mistakes, and nature does not care about your plans, so we learn to respect things bigger than ourselves. We learn that true strength is not about how much force you can use, but how much restraint you can show. A real man knows when to fight and when to walk away, when to be hard and when to be soft." Keiko listened carefully, her English improving daily through necessity and determination. She was beginning to understand that these Americans operated under a different definition of masculinity than she had known. Power was measured not by domination, but by protection. Strength was demonstrated through restraint rather than aggression. Honor came from keeping your word and treating others with dignity, even when they could not demand it. Especially when they could not demand it. December arrived with cold winds and shortened days. The women had been imprisoned for nearly 3 months, long enough for initial wariness to erode into something more complex and dangerous. Despite regulations prohibiting unnecessary interaction between guards and prisoners, genuine relationships were forming in the small moments between official duties. A shared joke transcending language barriers. A teaching moment that lingered longer than strictly necessary. Eye contact that held understanding neither side was supposed to acknowledge. Keiko found herself drawn into conversations with Billy Martinez that went beyond simple English lessons. He had begun teaching her about ranching, about the land, about Texas history told through stories his grandmother had shared. She, in turn, told him about Japan, about teaching school, about the poetry she had loved and the students she had hoped to inspire. They spoke in a mixture of simple English, gestures, and drawings scratched in the dust. The conversations were innocent in content, but dangerous in their growing intimacy. Lieutenant Crawford watched these developing connections with increasing concern. He understood that isolation and proximity naturally fostered bonds between people, regardless of their official designation as captor and captive. But he also knew that regulations existed for important reasons. Fraternization could compromise security, create conflicts of interest, and complicate an already unprecedented situation. Yet when he considered ordering stricter separation, he hesitated. The alternative, treating these women with cold institutional distance, felt wrong in ways he struggled to articulate. Yuki had formed her own unlikely friendship with Dr. Reynolds, who had begun visiting weekly to check on the women's health. The elderly physician, whose own daughter had died young, found himself looking forward to these visits. Yuki's medical knowledge impressed him, and he began bringing medical texts for her to study, teaching her anatomy and treatment protocols that went far beyond necessary prisoner care. They discussed cases and theories with the enthusiasm of colleagues rather than enemy nationals separated by war and circumstance. Even Tom Sullivan, who had maintained the firmest emotional boundaries, found those walls crumbling. He had begun sharing stories about his son Michael with the women during work details, showing them the photographs his boy sent home. The women listened with genuine interest, asking careful questions about American family life that revealed their own homesickness and worry for family members they had not heard from. Tom found himself seeing them not as abstract enemies, but as individuals with hopes and fears that mirrored his own family's experiences. But it was Fumiko's developing friendship with ranch hand Carlos Mendez that pushed closest to inappropriate territory. The 20-year-old guard and 19-year-old prisoner had discovered a shared love of music. Carlos played guitar in the evenings, and Fumiko had begun singing Japanese folk songs that blended surprisingly well with his Mexican ballads. They did not touch, barely spoke beyond necessary words, but the music they created together spoke of connection that transcended the barbed wire separating their worlds. Lieutenant Crawford knew he should stop it. All of it. But something in his gut told him that what was growing in this compound might be more valuable than strict adherence to regulations ever could be. January 1945 brought news that shook both sides of the compound fence. Reports from the Pacific Theater grew increasingly grim for Japan. American forces had landed in the Philippines, pushing steadily toward the Japanese home islands. The war that once seemed distant to the isolated Texas ranch now felt oppressively close, its eventual outcome becoming clearer with each passing week. Lieutenant Crawford received newspapers and military briefings that he was required to share with the prisoners under Geneva Convention guidelines. He dreaded these sessions, knowing the information would cause pain, but duty demanded transparency. The women gathered in tense silence as he read translated summaries: Japanese casualties mounting, cities under sustained bombing, supply lines collapsing, the Empire's defensive perimeter shrinking day by day toward the home islands. But it was not the military defeats that shattered the women's understanding of their world. It was the emerging stories about how the war had been conducted by their own forces. Reports filtered through about treatment of prisoners, about forced labor, about atrocities committed in occupied territories. The accounts came from American sources, so the women initially dismissed them as propaganda designed to demoralize enemy captives. Yet the details were too specific, too consistent, too numerous to ignore completely. Keiko sat in the barn reading a newspaper article about Allied prisoners freed from Japanese camps. The descriptions of starvation, disease, and systematic cruelty made her hands shake. She thought about her own treatment at this Texas ranch. The warm meals from Margaret Sullivan's kitchen. The medical care when Michiko fell ill. The patient teaching and careful respect shown even when language failed. The contrast between how she had been treated as a prisoner and how these articles described Japanese prisoner camps created a cognitive dissonance she could not reconcile. Yuki approached these revelations with her characteristic directness. As a nurse, she had witnessed things during her service that troubled her even then. Wounded prisoners left untreated, while Japanese soldiers received care. Civilian populations in occupied territories denied medical resources. Orders that prioritized military honor over humanitarian concerns. She had rationalized these decisions as wartime necessity, as cultural differences in how honor and duty were defined. Now she was forced to consider whether she had witnessed not cultural differences, but systematic cruelty she had been too frightened or too indoctrinated to name correctly. That evening, the women's whispered conversations took on a darker tone. Haruko spoke of rumors she had heard but dismissed during her service. Fumiko admitted to witnessing treatment of Chinese civilians that had troubled her conscience even then. One by one, the women began acknowledging things they had seen, heard, or suspected, but had suppressed through loyalty, fear, or willful ignorance. Keiko voiced what others were thinking but dreaded saying aloud. What if we were not the honorable ones? What if our enemies knew something about us that we did not know about ourselves? The question hung in the cold January air, unanswerable and unbearable. Outside the barn, they could hear Carlos's guitar playing a melancholy tune. The music sounded like mourning, which seemed appropriate for women grieving the death of everything they had believed their country represented. August 9, 1945. The world changed in fire and light over Nagasaki, 3 days after Hiroshima burned. News reached the Texas compound through crackling radio broadcasts that Lieutenant Crawford gathered everyone to hear. The war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. Emperor Hirohito himself would address the nation, an unprecedented act that signaled how completely the old order had collapsed. The 17 women sat in stunned silence as the implications washed over them. They were no longer prisoners of war. Repatriation procedures would begin immediately. Within weeks, they would board ships bound for a homeland they had not seen in over a year, returning to families they had not heard from in months, to a country that had been bombed into submission and occupation. Keiko should have felt relief, even joy. Instead, she felt a hollow dread growing in her chest. That evening, unable to sleep, she walked the perimeter of the compound under Billy Martinez's watch. He had volunteered for night duty, perhaps sensing that this day would leave the women needing quiet presence rather than solitude. They walked in silence for several minutes before Keiko spoke in the careful English she had worked so hard to master. "Billy, what is left of Japan now? What am I returning to?" He had no good answer to give her. The reports described devastation beyond comprehension. Cities reduced to ash, infrastructure destroyed. Millions dead or displaced. A military government dismantled. An economy in ruins. The social order that had defined Japanese life for centuries upended by occupation and defeat. But it was not just the physical destruction that terrified her. It was the knowledge of what her country had done, of what she had unknowingly served. How could she return and face her parents, her former students, her community, carrying this knowledge? How could she participate in rebuilding a society whose foundations had been so thoroughly corrupted? What did it mean to be Japanese now, when being Japanese had meant supporting atrocities she could never have imagined? The next morning, Yuki approached Lieutenant Crawford with a question that had kept her awake all night. "Sir, when we are repatriated, are we required to return immediately to Japan, or are there other options for displaced persons?" Crawford was caught off guard by the question. He had assumed the women would be eager to return home after months of imprisonment. The idea that any might prefer to remain in America had never occurred to him. That evening, the women gathered for the most difficult conversation they had ever shared. Yuki spoke first, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "I do not know if I can return. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I do not know who I would be in the Japan that exists now." Fumiko nodded slowly, tears streaming down her young face. "Here, I have become someone different. Someone I think might be better than who I was before. What if going back means losing that person?" Keiko looked around at her companions, then at the compound that had been their prison and had somehow become their refuge. "We need to decide," she said quietly, "what home truly means." The conversation continued late into the night, voices rising and falling in heated debate, tears flowing freely as the women confronted the choice that would define the rest of their lives. Not all of them shared the same doubts about returning. Haruko argued passionately that their duty lay in helping rebuild Japan, that abandoning their country in its darkest hour would be dishonorable. 6 other women agreed, insisting that whatever Japan had become, it was still their homeland, still the place where their families waited. But 11 women, led by Keiko and Yuki, found themselves unable to embrace that certainty. Fumiko spoke through tears about the shame she would face returning as a captured soldier, a woman who had failed in her duty and been corrupted by enemy influence. "In Japan, I will always be marked by this failure. But here, I have been treated as if my life has value beyond my usefulness to the state." Michiko, whose near death from cold had catalyzed the first real connection between prisoners and captors, added her own quiet observation. "Mr. Sullivan carried me to his home when I was dying. His wife wrapped me in her own quilts. They treated me as they would treat their own daughter. I did not have to earn that kindness through service or sacrifice. They gave it simply because I needed it." She paused, struggling to articulate something profound. "I did not know that kind of generosity existed in the world." Keiko had been writing in her diary, trying to process the impossible decision before them. She read aloud what she had written, her English now fluent enough to capture complex emotions. "We were taught that Americans were barbaric, that they had no honor, no culture, no respect for human dignity. Every day here has proven those teachings to be lies. If we were lied to about this, what else were we lied to about? How can we trust anything we were taught about duty, honor, or what it means to serve our country?" The question sparked deeper discussion about identity and belonging. These women had defined themselves through service to Japan, through their roles as auxiliary corps members supporting the military effort. That identity had been stripped away by defeat and capture. In the months since, they had been forced to construct new understandings of who they were beyond their national allegiance. The process had been painful but also strangely liberating. Yuki articulated what many felt but feared to say. "Here, I am not judged by my family's status or my usefulness to the state. I am valued for my skills, my character, my individual worth. In Japan, I will return to being a woman whose primary value is in marriage and producing children. Everything I have learned, everything I have become here, will be meaningless there." Lieutenant Crawford, who had been listening from just outside the barn door, realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. These women were not simply choosing between countries. They were choosing between versions of themselves, between who they had been and who they might become. Word of the Japanese women's conflicted feelings about repatriation spread beyond the compound, carried by loose-lipped ranch hands into the small town of Clearwater, 15 miles down the road. The reaction was immediate and divided. At the local diner, heated debates erupted between neighbors who had known each other for decades. Some argued vehemently that enemy prisoners should be grateful to return home alive and should not be allowed to remain on American soil. Others, particularly those who had interacted with the women through church outreach programs, defended their right to choose their own futures. Margaret Sullivan found herself at the center of the controversy when she attended her weekly quilting circle at the Methodist Church. Louise Patterson, whose nephew had died at Guadalcanal, spoke with barely controlled anger. "Those Jap girls have some nerve asking to stay here after what their country did to our boys. They should be shipped back where they came from and be glad we are not doing to them what they did to our prisoners." But Reverend Thomas Mitchell's wife Helen, who had visited the compound with charity baskets, responded with equal passion. "Have you met them, Louise? Have you spoken with them? They are not monsters. They are young women who were lied to about their country's actions, who are genuinely horrified by what they have learned. Turning them away when they are seeking redemption seems distinctly unchristian to me." The debate reached the town council meeting, where Mayor Robert Franklin called for a vote on whether Clearwater would welcome any former prisoners who chose to settle in the area. The meeting room filled beyond capacity, with residents spilling into the hallway. Billy Martinez attended, standing in the back alongside Tom Sullivan and several other ranch hands. When the mayor opened the floor for comment, Billy surprised everyone by speaking up. "I have worked alongside these women for months now," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite his nervousness. "I have watched them work hard, learn our language, respect our customs. Miss Tanaka helps translate for the doctor. Miss Nakamura has medical skills we need in this county. They are not asking for charity. They are asking for a chance to contribute and to build honest lives here." His grandmother, seated in the front row, nodded approvingly at her grandson's courage. The meeting lasted 3 hours, with passionate arguments on both sides. Some speakers questioned how Americans could justify showing mercy to former enemies when the war's wounds were still fresh. Others argued that America's strength lay in its capacity for forgiveness and its willingness to offer second chances to those who genuinely sought them. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than expected. 11 votes in favor of welcoming the women, 9 against. Outside the meeting hall, Margaret Sullivan approached Louise Patterson, the woman who had spoken so angrily earlier. "Louise," she said gently, "I know you have suffered terribly. But these girls did not kill your nephew. They are victims of the same war that took him from you. Punishing them will not bring him back." The morning of September 20th, 1945, arrived heavy with consequence. Lieutenant Crawford had received final orders from the War Department. Repatriation ships were scheduled to depart from San Francisco in 2 weeks. All prisoners who wished to return to Japan would be transported to the port for processing. Those who wished to remain would need to secure sponsorship, housing, and employment within 30 days or face deportation regardless of their preference. The women gathered one final time as a complete group. The 6 who had chosen immediate repatriation, led by Haruko, sat on one side of the barn. The 11 who wished to stay, led by Keiko and Yuki, sat on the other. The physical separation mirrored the emotional divide that had grown between them over the past weeks. Yet, despite their different choices, they remained bound by shared experience. Haruko spoke first, her voice carrying no judgment, only sadness. "I understand why you want to stay. Part of me envies the freedom you will have here. But Japan is our mother country. She is wounded and needs her daughters to help heal her. I cannot abandon her, no matter how comfortable or safe it might be to remain in America. The women choosing repatriation nodded, some wiping away tears. Keiko responded with equal respect. "I do not judge your choice, Haruko. You are braver than I am, returning to face what must be faced. But I have learned something here that I cannot unlearn. I have discovered that my worth is not defined by the state I serve, but by the person I choose to become. I want to continue becoming that person, and I can only do that here." The decision brought tears to all their eyes, but also a sense of resolution. They had made their choices consciously and deliberately, accepting the consequences that would follow. The Henderson family had offered to sponsor Keiko, providing housing in their guest cottage and helping her seek employment as a translator. Dr. Reynolds had arranged for Yuki to continue her medical training at the county hospital, writing letters of recommendation that emphasized her skill and dedication. Billy Martinez's grandmother had offered to sponsor Fumiko, who would work in her dress shop while learning the tailoring trade. One by one, the women who chose to stay found sponsors in the community. Not everyone in Clearwater welcomed them, but enough did to make their transition possible. They would face suspicion, occasional hostility, and the constant challenge of building lives in a foreign land. But they had chosen these challenges over the alternative of returning to a Japan they no longer recognized or understood. The day of departure arrived too quickly. The women who were leaving prepared their few belongings, writing final letters to family members they hoped still lived. Those staying gathered to say goodbye, exchanging addresses and promises to write. Margaret Sullivan provided food for the journey, pressing packages into each woman's hands with fierce hugs that transcended language and nationality. Tom Sullivan stood awkwardly nearby, his weathered face revealing more emotion than he had shown in months. The 6 women boarded the military transport truck that would take them to San Francisco, their faces a mixture of determination and fear. Haruko looked back one final time at the compound that had been their prison and their transformation. She locked eyes with Keiko, and in that moment, both women understood that neither choice was wrong, just different paths toward the same goal of finding meaning after everything they had believed was destroyed. The 11 who remained stood watching until the truck disappeared into the Texas dust. Then, with quiet resolve, they turned to face their new lives. The transition from prisoners to immigrants proved more challenging than any of them had anticipated. Despite sponsorships and community support, they faced daily reminders that they were former enemies living among people whose sons, brothers, and husbands had died fighting Japan. Keiko's first week working at the county courthouse as a translator brought confrontations she had not expected. A veteran returning from the Pacific spat at her feet and called her names she was grateful not to fully understand. Mrs. Henderson witnessed the incident and immediately intervened, her school teacher authority silencing the man's vitriol. But Keiko understood that such moments would be part of her life for years to come. She could not blame Americans for their anger, could only work to prove through her actions that she was not the enemy they believed her to be. Yuki faced similar challenges at the hospital. Some nurses refused to work with her, questioning how she could be trusted with patient care when her country had treated prisoners with such cruelty. Dr. Reynolds defended her consistently, pointing to her skill and dedication. Gradually, through countless small acts of competence and compassion, she began to win over skeptics. The day a veteran's wife specifically requested Yuki to care for her husband, citing her gentle manner and skilled touch, marked a turning point in her acceptance. Fumiko discovered unexpected joy working in Billy's grandmother's dress shop. The elderly woman, herself an immigrant from Mexico, understood the complexity of building a life between two cultures. She taught Fumiko not just tailoring but also how to navigate the unspoken rules of American society, how to meet suspicion with grace, how to respond to hostility with quiet dignity, how to build trust through consistency rather than grand gestures. The 11 women gathered weekly at the Henderson home, maintaining the bonds forged during their imprisonment. They supported each other through difficulties, celebrated small victories, and reminded one another why they had made this choice. Letters arrived from Japan, from Haruko and the others who had returned. The descriptions of devastation were heartbreaking, but also filled with determination to rebuild. Both groups of women were engaged in reconstruction, just in different lands. Billy Martinez had become a regular visitor to these gatherings, ostensibly to help with translation when needed, but really because he found himself drawn to Keiko's quiet strength and growing confidence. Their friendship had deepened into something neither was quite ready to name, but which everyone around them could clearly see developing. 25 years after that September morning when the women made their choices, Keiko Martinez stood in her garden in Clearwater, Texas, watching her teenage daughter help Margaret Sullivan, now in her 80s, tend the tomato plants. The scene represented everything she had hoped for when she chose to stay. A life built on chosen family, on bridges between cultures, on the possibility of redemption through daily acts of kindness and contribution. She had married Billy Martinez in 1948, after 3 years of courtship that scandalized some and inspired others. Their wedding had been attended by both supporters and protesters, but Tom and Margaret Sullivan had stood beside them as witnesses, their presence lending legitimacy that silenced many critics. The marriage had produced 3 children, who moved seamlessly between their mother's Japanese heritage and their father's Mexican-American roots, embodying the complicated beauty of reconciliation. Yuki had never married, dedicating herself instead to medicine. She had become the head nurse at Clearwater General Hospital, training generations of nurses in both clinical skills and the importance of treating every patient with dignity regardless of their background. Her story had been featured in nursing journals as an example of how former enemies could become healers in adopted homelands. Letters continued to arrive from Japan, though less frequently as the years passed. Haruko had married and raised 4 children while working as a teacher in rebuilt Tokyo. Her letters spoke of Japan's remarkable recovery, of how the nation had transformed itself from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy. She credited her time in American captivity with helping her understand that true strength came through cooperation rather than domination, lessons she tried to instill in her students. The legacy of those 17 women extended far beyond their individual lives. Their story had been documented by scholars studying post-war reconciliation, cited in policy discussions about immigration and refugee resettlement. The unprecedented choice they faced, and the grace with which both groups handled their divergent decisions, had become a symbol of how former enemies could find paths toward mutual understanding. Keiko had been invited to speak at universities and community groups about her experience. She always brought the small jade pendant her grandmother had given her for protection against enemies, using it to illustrate how we often need protection not from the people we are taught to fear, but from the lies we are told about them. She spoke about the Cowboys who were 3 times bigger than Japanese men, but who wielded their strength with restraint and gentleness. About discovering that true masculinity meant protecting rather than dominating, serving rather than conquering. As the sun set over the Texas prairie, casting long shadows across the land that had become her home, Keiko reflected on the gift she had been given. Not freedom, which would have simply meant returning to Japan, but choice, which meant the ability to define her own identity separate from national allegiance or cultural expectation. America had not just allowed her to stay, it had allowed her to become someone she never could have been otherwise. That, she understood, was the real promise of redemption, the true meaning of home, and the most profound victory over the hatred that had once divided their worlds.